Hello everyone. In this video I would like to discuss Francis Bacon and his essays. Francis Bacon, as you can see from your text, was born in 1561. He lived into the late 1620s, 1626 to be exact. He was born in the city of London to a relatively prosperous family. He was educated at Cambridge University, where he went when he began when he was 12 years old. This, by the way, was not highly unusual in those days because life expectancy was shorter. You see, Bacon's own life was not terribly long. You wanted to get a start in those days on your education because one didn't know how many decades one would have in active life. So Cambridge University, where he left without taking a degree, he went from there to study law. This was done more or less informally in England at the time. There was a series of, should we say, buildings or institutions in the heart of London called the Inns, I-N-N-S, the Inns of Court. This is not the last time we'll mention them this semester, by the way. That's where the courts were held, and that's where lawyers plied their trade. And so if you were interested in law, you would hang around the Inns of Court and observe how people comported themselves. And eventually you might get thrown a little bit of scrap work to do here and there, and if you proved able with that kind of thing, then your career began its rise. Speaking of careers and rising, Bacon tried, despite being friends with the enormously powerful Earl of Essex, tried to gain important political position under Queen Elizabeth and was never able to manage it, but under King James, he did manage to get a pretty rapid rise, aided in part by his prosecution of his old friend, the Earl of Essex, on a charge of treason. So you can see what people were willing to do in those days to gain political advantage. Eventually, Francis Bacon, moving up the political ladder very rapidly, became the most powerful man in England, aside from the king himself, and his fall from power was just as rapid. He himself was eventually brought up on charges of the taking of bribes and very briefly imprisoned, and then after that left public life, and in the later 1620s devoted himself entirely to his other main interest in life, and that is science and the shall we say philosophy. And I hasten to add that in those days essentially science and philosophy were not two separate disciplines. In fact, what we now call science was called natural philosophy, that is, the understanding of the way nature works. And so Bacon's interest in what we call science would also have been an interest would have carried with it an interest in philosophy, particularly in Bacon's case, and appropriately for the Renaissance, in which all of the old medieval certainties were being called into question. The branch of science known as epistemology. Epistemology is primarily, is the study of what we can know and how we can know it. And remember, as I mentioned before in this course, that in the Middle Ages, the hallmark of intellectual life was submission to authority. Thomas Aquinas, the great philosopher of the Middle Ages, if he can argue you back, if he's discussing a controversial point, if he can get back to Scripture, or if he can get back to a recognized authority among the philosophers, for instance, then he has proved his point. For Bacon, coming in the Renaissance, the idea is not so much to bow to authority, but since all minds are, roughly speaking, all minds are equal, anyone may have the next new big idea, the more successful way of doing things. And so Bacon is particularly interested then in trying to, if we're going to say that no longer do we find authority to be the last answer when it comes to the intellect, that thinking and careful thinking and productive thinking goes well beyond just memorizing what authorities have told us, then we have to develop a new science of thinking. And this he did try to do in the over the course of his life, worked on a number of works, the Advancement of Learning, for instance, which was to be part of a much larger work which never got finished, called the Instauratio Magna, and Another work called the Novum Organon, taking its cue from Aristotle's Organon, composed of several works that talk about how to think, essentially a science of logic. Bacon was interested in that kind of thing himself, and was developing a kind of philosophy, shall we say, philosophical explanation of the importance of induction as a method. And we know that induction, that is observation of phenomena and then arriving at general laws based on those observations, is absolutely crucial to an understanding of science. So Bacon really does tie in an important way to the history of science that really begins in earnest in the Renaissance. So that's a bit of brief background to Bacon. Those other works I mentioned are really what Bacon is best known for, along with another very interesting work called The New Atlantis, which is a kind of utopia, gives forth an ideal, whether or not it's Bacon's ideal is hard to say, but an ideal of society. The great-grandfather of these, of course, being Plato's Republic. And here in our course we confront an occasional peculiarity of English literature, and that is that sometimes the works we read as students of literature are not necessarily the works for which a writer is most famous. I think, for instance, about Wordsworth, who is most famously read, I suppose, for his lyric poems, and then, if you get into a long poem, maybe the prelude, when in fact Wordsworth viewed his great work as The Excursion, a work that's really not taught at all and not read except by specialists. Another example would include, earlier than Wordsworth, Alexander Pope. We tend to read those glittering satires of Pope, and it's well that we do so, because there's some magnificent writing there, and yet Pope was far and away better known in his own lifetime for his translations of Homer, which nobody reads, and certainly nobody really teaches in classes any longer. So Bacon is another example of this. His essays are certainly by no means his most important work in terms of what he considered his life work, but they are the portion that endures in English literature classes, in part because they're each of them short and easily digestible, to use an image that he himself is going to use in one of his essays, and because they illustrate very nicely many of his ideas, and many ideas central to the new scientific spirit of the Renaissance. Oh, I might add, by the way, speaking of scientific matters, that the old tradition is, I should have mentioned this in the biographical section of our discussion, the old tradition is that so dedicated was Bacon to science in his last years that he died after catching pneumonia, which he contracted while stuffing a chicken with snow, which was a experiment in how long organic materials could be refrigerated and this kind of thing. So I believe that's a controversial point. Whether or not it happened in exactly that way is hard to say, but there you go. So back to the essays. What shall we say about these? First published in 1598, I believe, and went through a number of revisions in his lifetime. Very popular. The essays are sort of, in some ways, imitations of the essays of the 16th century French writer Montaigne, and not terribly much earlier than Bacon, in fact writing when Bacon was a young man, but Montaigne's essay is enormously popular in French and translated into English, and Bacon is following suit there. There are some differences between Montaigne and Bacon, among others in length. Some of Montaigne's essays can be quite lengthy. Bacon's tend to be very short. But at any rate, Montaigne is certainly, and by the way, Bacon in his first essay, it's always his essay of truth is usually the first in any printed collection of the essays. He cites Montaigne in that very essay, so Bacon certainly not shy about listing Montaigne as a model. And perhaps if you go further back, I mean, it's generally agreed that Montaigne invented the form of the essay, at least in modern times, but if we go back to classical times, you can find things like the essays among the Greek writer Plutarch, for instance, or the Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca, who in his, these supposed epistles that he writes, these moral epistles, They tend to be essays on a variety of different topics, offering both, in some ways very similar to Bacon, offering both sort of philosophical, generalized philosophical discussion of the topic under consideration, and also mix either then going on to or mixing with that practical observations about how one should respond to whatever the topic is at hand. He's also a bit like Seneca, also stylistically. We're going to see examples of other types of prose writing in the 17th century, but when it comes to Bacon, one of the hallmarks of Bacon's prose style is that his sentences tend to be relatively short. They tend to be sententious, that is, they tend to be a bit aphoristic. They tend toward the short, to the pungent, to the easily memorized, that kind of thing. They tend to, grammatically speaking, to be a series of independent clauses. And this isn't always true, of course. This is almost a caricature, but it's a general observation that has some truth. They tend to be any given sentence tends to be an independent clause or a collection of independent clauses. And and that's in contrast with some of the other writers of the 17th century, but it is very much like Seneca, who's relatively easy to read in Latin because his sentences are not terribly long. They also tend to be short, independent clauses without a lot of subordination in them. Another hallmark of Bacon's sentence style that you will no doubt have noticed at this point is this emphasis on tripartite division, tripartite structures. And we can see all of these hallmarks really in the very first essay, the essay of truth. As I say, it's usually given pride of play. It's usually the first, if not one of the first essays that's published in any collection of Bacon's essays. Important because, as I mentioned earlier, Bacon is interested in epistemology. He's interested in how we think, in some ways even more than what it is we should think. He's interested in how people should think and what the rules of thinking should be. And one of these, of course, is to think clearly and truthfully and not to give way to what Bacon calls the lie. And so this first essay on truth is much concerned with falsehood in thinking. In fact, it might almost better be called the lie, because he spends more time talking about what to avoid in thinking, that is, untruths and falsehoods, more than what to embrace. And you see the various hallmarks of his prose style here. There is the relatively short sentence structures. As you see at the very beginning, the very first sentence is 3 words long. What is truth? Said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. It's a relatively short, brief sentences, clauses that are easy to understand. And you see the whole general structure of the essay is tripartite. He first talks about the theological truth, which he introduces by the reference to the Gospel of John there with Pilate and Christ, to philosophical truth, which he tackles in the middle of the essay, and then finally in the last paragraph, truth in civil business, or truth in one's daily affairs. So there is that general tripartite structure to the piece. If one looks earlier, this would be the top of the right-hand column of page 40 in the green tome, that is Witherspoon and Warnke. He says that where does it go? Howsoever these things are thus in men's depraved judgments and affections, yet truth, which only doth judge itself, teaches the inquiry of truth, which is the love-making, the wooing of it, the knowledge of truth, which is the presence of it, and the belief of truth, which is the enjoying of it. So there you see within that one sentence a tripartite structure. So his mind tends to run in these groups of threes and tends to organize ideas into these groups of threes. So we find that there. The other point I would like to make about this particular essay, again, is the emphasis on clear thinking. It doesn't ultimately do any good. He does admit that falsehood is pleasing. It can be emotionally pleasing, as he says, the emphasis, he talks about the love of the lie, and about 2/3 of the way down the left-hand column on page 40, a mixture of a lie doth ever add pleasure. Indeed it does. When you're talking to your significant other later in the day about how incredibly boring and awful this video on Francis Bacon no doubt is, you will almost certainly enhance the, I'm not making a claim that this ought to receive any kind of broadcast award in broadcast excellence, but that no doubt you will exaggerate, right, for the sake of effect, because it gives pleasure and adds importance and weight to what you're saying. That's a truism. And it is a temptation which can eventually lead one astray. So Bacon says that we should be careful about that. If we really are in a new world which has done away with authority, that raises some great challenges. If the world is not simply how authorities tell us it is, then it's upon us to figure out the way the world works and how we should behave in it. And if that's the case, we're going to need to think very, very clearly about it. This may seem a bit remote and abstract and philosophical to you, but just imagine, take what I've said and put it in the realm of medicine, right? A doctor who's trying to diagnose a mysterious ailment in a patient. Is it important that he gets it right, or is it important that he doesn't get it right? These are difficult. I mean, it's quite obvious what the answer would be in that context, and so also generally philosophically, it's important to get things right. So another of the essays, which I think I asked you to read, is the essay of Death. I don't know that I want to spend a huge amount of time in detail on this essay, but it is I like the wonderfully sententious opening of that. And remember that life expectancy was much shorter in Bacon's day. It's primarily because of the scientific and technological revolution at the forefront of which Bacon stood in the early 17th century that we can expect a longer life expectancy. But here he begins the essay on death by very sententiously, men fear death as children fear to go in the dark. Once again, a short independent clause. And as that natural fear in children is increased with tales, so is the fear of death increased with tales. And so Bacon's point here is, as a rational man of science, we don't need to fear death. As Christians, we certainly don't need to fear death. And he goes on to really put in prose what is a common trope, is a common idea in the 17th century, and that is that death isn't nearly as powerful as we often give it credit for being. The 17th century is much concerned with death for various reasons that we might discuss later. We'll see this concern everywhere in the literature that we read going forward. But this emphasis on death and concern with death, one of the corollaries to that is that good writers not infrequently make the point that death is not something to be feared. It's not nearly as powerful as our fearful imaginations make it seem. We're going to discuss a poem by John Donne on just this topic. Earlier, his famous sonnet 10, Death Be Not Proud. And in that sonnet, Donne talks about how, if I can find it here, I hadn't thought that I would be looking at, well, here we go. That I would be adducing this now, and I don't know whether we'll get to it when we discuss Donne. But his famous Holy Sonnet 10, Death Be Not Proud, he says, Death be not proud, though some have called thee so. So though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. Death is not mighty and dreadful. And then it turns out death is not mighty and dreadful, according to Donne, because those who die don't really die. The people you overthrow die not, poor death, right? They go on to eternal life in heaven. And we love rest and sleep are very much like death. They're temporary deaths, and we love that. So imagine how much more pleasure will come from death when we enter into our eternal reward. and death is slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. So death can't come unless others actually summon it and tell it what to do. Death hangs out with such terrible substances as poison, war, and sickness, and so on. And then finally, Donne goes on to make the point in that last stanza, following St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, that at the end of time, eventually death itself will die because of the resurrection of Christ at the last judgment. And so death is not nearly as strong as it thinks it is. And so Francis Bacon as well, in his essay of death, towards the bottom of the left-hand column on page 41, it is worthy the observing that there is no passion in the mind of man so weak, but it mates and masters the fear of death. That there are a lot of people that are willing to do lots of even apparently silly things, though they do them at the risk of death. That is to say, the fear of death is not as powerful as the desire for these other things. And therefore death is no such terrible enemy when a man has so many attendants about him that can win the combat of him. Revenge triumphs over death, love slights it, and so on, that one's willing to risk one's life for doing all sorts of things. That means death isn't nearly as powerful as we think it is. Yes. So by the way, notice that in the right-hand column on page 41, that Bacon quotes. Pardon me. He quotes the Roman philosopher Seneca with approval, as I mentioned. Lots in this essay, lots quotation, as we're going to see, for instance, on the essay of friendship, a lot of quotation of classical authors, direct quotation of Latin writers, in fact. Latin being sort of the lingua franca of any well-educated person at the time. So there is sort of, in many ways, a more or less characteristic discussion of death from Bacon's pen, and yet it's expressed in ways that are typical of Bacon, with these short, pithy sentences. We see the same kind of thing in marriage and single life, which begins, oddly enough, with a sentence that has troubled me often over the years, just in terms of sheer interpretation. What does it mean? He that hath wife and children hath given hostages for fortune, for they are impediments to great enterprises, either virtue or mischief. So I'm thinking of that just as a hostage would complicate one's life. For instance, and one thinks of this particularly in terms of battle, which is where the notion of hostage probably gains its greatest force in Bacon's day, that the general who has a good army ought to be able to do what he wants and conquer at will with this army. But if the enemy is holding hostages, think of human shields, for instance, used in places like the Middle East, that complicates things, right? So if you want a life where you do great things, if you want to achieve great stuff in life, well, having a wife and kids complicates that. It's not so easy, and we see this all the time in our own lives, that people who achieve great things very often have rather miserable family lives. And a perfect example of this I think of when I think of ancient Greek mythology, which is always telling great and profound truths in story form. I think about Agamemnon, who's the great commander-in-chief of all the Greek forces, and his, at the moment, his big public concern is that he has to rally all the Greek forces. They gather at one point in their ships, and then they have to set sail for Troy, right? And that's his great public responsibility. The winds are unfavorable, so when he consults a prophet, asks the prophet what needs to happen for the winds to become favorable so they can sail quickly to Troy, the prophet tells him, you have to sacrifice your daughter. And so Agamemnon does sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia, because his public role is more pressing, more important than his role as a family man. And that's the kind of idea that you see here of marriage and a single life, that at the beginning, I should say, of that. And it's a good, balanced, I think, fair assessment of things in this essay. Bacon understands in what ways having a wife and family is a good in life, and in what way it can interfere with life. Notice the tripart division. By the way, as he says in the second sentence, certainly the best works and of greatest merit for the public have proceeded from the unmarried or childless men. You're freer to do. By the way, this is the old theory of the Catholic Church, the celibacy of the clergy, that one of the theories, by the way, is that they can do more, they can go more, they can do exactly what is necessary if they don't have to worry about a family. And then very quickly after that, the tripartite division. Yet it were a great reason that those that have children should have greatest care of future times, unto which they know they must transmit their dearest judges. Some there are who, though they lead a single life, yet in their thoughts do end with themselves. Nay, there are some other that account wife and children but as bills of charges. So there are people who aren't married. The attitude toward marriage can be colored by their, should we say, as he says, greatest care, or their debt to the future. There are those who just really don't think beyond themselves and therefore don't think of a family. And then there are others who think that having a wife and kids is just too expensive, and they would rather enjoy a life where they get to spend their own income. He goes on to say that about halfway down the right-hand column on page 42 is that the main reason for remaining single is liberty. And the most ordinary cause of a single life is liberty. And then he talks about things in which unmarried men excel. They excel as friends, as masters, as servants, right, and so on. A single life is good for being a churchman, right? If it's important for a churchman to teach charity by giving things away, that's harder to do when you've got a wife and kids and you've got other immediate needs to worry about in your own family. And then finally, towards the end, when he talks about marriage, he talks about people being married. Near the end, this is about halfway down the left-hand column on page 43. Again, the combination of the sententious short, pithy style with a tripartite division. Wives are young men's mistresses, companions for middle age, and old men's nurses. Right? And so it's that's absolutely typical statement by Bacon. And that essay is more or less consonant to some of the things he says in the next essay in your text of love, where he talks about how love can be a very good thing. There are different kinds of love, of course, not only romantic love, but that romantic love can certainly complicate life. And then at the very end of that essay comes the tripartite division again. The nuptial love maketh mankind, that is, love within a marriage produces offspring. Nuptial love maketh mankind, friendly love perfecteth it, right? And then finally, wanton love, that is kind of just sexual lust and giving into sexual temptation, corrupteth and embaseth it. So that's, again, Francis Bacon's rather practical and sober advice about love. But of course, he's a scientist. He's not a poet. He's a clear thinker. Bacon would like to think himself as being, and so he's not going to romanticize or be sentimental in his reflections on love. The next essay in your text is one that's useful to read in regard to Bacon, because he did achieve great position and great status in life. So that's his essay Of Great Place. That is to say, great positions, great states in life. And once again begins with a tripartite division. Men in great place are... and by the way, I should say this essay is a good illustration of how Bacon gives us the philosophical discussion of what of generally speaking, making general observations about, sort of the demands of high public office. That's what he means by great place. But then also giving us practical advice about how to behave in such places should you find yourself in that condition. Men in great place are thrice servants: servants of the sovereign state, servants of fame or reputation, and servants of business. So if you've got a high political office, you are enslaved or ensnared by three things that compromise your freedom. First of all, there is just the sort of politics of the situation. Secondly, you've got a reputation. I mean, nobody cares what I do because nobody knows who I am, but everybody cares what President Bush does or what Joe Biden does or President Trump does or President Obama. They have to be careful about what they do. They have to watch their step. And then servants of business. Can you imagine anything worse than having a job like President of the United States where you're constantly busy, constantly on call? People are always demanding your attention and so on. This is again, this tripartite division and this very clear examination of the situation itself. There are, towards the second half of the essay, it's the long paragraph which begins in the right-hand column on page 44. He gives us lots of good practical advice about people who are in high positions. In the discharge of thy place, set before thee the best examples, for imitation is a globe of precepts. By the way, notice that sentence is just two simple independent clauses joined by the conjunction for. Yes, make sure you've got good examples to follow. That's the very best way to learn. As he goes on to say, don't neglect the examples of those that did not do well in office, right? Learn to avoid their mistakes. He goes on to talk about the importance of preserving the rights of inferior places. Don't try to, if you get a particularly powerful position, don't try to make it more powerful by destroying positions underneath you and assuming their business. That will only complicate your life and it will only breed bad feeling. Let's see, what else does he say? He also goes on to say that if you he makes the interesting point in the final paragraph, this toward the middle of the left column on page 45. It is most true what was anciently spoken, a place showeth the man. Yes, the best way to look at someone's character is to see how that person behaves when that person is given power, right? If a person is a good human being, if a person has got a lot of integrity, then power won't corrupt him. But power does tend to corrupt, as another English nobleman, Lord Acton, said about, what should we say, 250 years or so after Bacon. Power tends to corrupt. So it's a great test of character to give someone a high position and see how the person does there. He mentions also as well, towards near the very end of this essay, if you accept a high position, don't constantly abuse the person who was in office before you. Don't constantly say things about them. It goes on to say, use the memory of thy predecessor fairly and tenderly, right? Be careful about attacking the previous president and blaming him constantly for all your problems. For one reason, as soon as you leave office, the next person is going to do that to you if he has your example to follow in that regard. So another bit of sage advice from Bacon on how to conduct oneself in great places and high places. The essay on travel, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on, just rather briefly, but it's an interesting essay. Bacon himself traveled when he was younger in France, among other places, and he talks about the importance of travel as a part of education, right? Travel in the younger sort is a part of education, and in the older it's a kind of experience. For older people, it can confirm and cement what they already know. For young people, it will show them all sorts of new things that they didn't know. I like his use of the list there, right in the middle of the right-hand column on page 45, giving us a list of all the different places we should see when we go to different countries. When you go to different countries. The things to be seen and observed are courts of princes, the courts of justice, churches and monasteries, walls and fortifications of cities. Go look at the havens and harbors. Go look at the museums and libraries, the colleges, listen to people arguing, listen to lectures, the shipping and the navy, and so on, which, by the way, gives us an idea of the universality of Bacon's interests in those days. Also says much about the importance of keeping a diary when you travel. Make sure that you jot down your recollections of things so that later on in life they will become pleasant for you. It'll help you recollect the journey that you made. And towards the end, there comes this very nice bit of advice. He talks about how when you return home, right, make sure you keep some of your travels with you in the form of writing letters, corresponding with people that you have met in these countries. And then finally, he says, don't adopt weird customs or customs that will appear weird when you don't adopt from foreign cultures customs that will appear weird when you get back to your own society. As he says, for instance, don't wear weird clothes, that costumes from another society. But do select some flowers, little remembrances, some little hints of character that you've picked up from foreign shores. That gives you a type of that makes people somewhat interested in your character. It gives you a very slight touch of distinction, rather than oddness or eccentricity, if that kind of thing is pursued too far. So there's Bacon as the good sound, the good follower of sound and sober common sense. The essay on friendship, again, I'm not going to discuss it in great detail. It's relatively clear. A couple of remarks I want to make on it. Notice that friendship is really one of the great goods of life, and this is one of the longer essays, certainly compared with the ones that we are discussing today. And it is also divided into three main sections. He talks about three main benefits of friendship. The first benefit of friendship is that friendship allows us to unburden our minds. So when we're feeling anxious, when we're feeling upset about whatever things are bothering us, we can talk to our friends. We have friends on hand that we can talk to that will help us feel better about these things. And then secondly, the second main benefit of friendship is that gives us another mind to consult. That is, we can learn things, or if we find ourselves in doubts and difficulties, a friend can give us good advice, can increase our share of wisdom, as it were. And then finally, the third part of friendship, and he's more cautious about this, is that the person can actually help you, perhaps in material ways. If you find yourself in difficulties, you can go to the person and ask for particular kinds of aid. So there is that generally tripartite division. In this essay, also, I should point out, too, one thing that strikes me about this essay is the sheer number of examples from classical antiquity, from ancient Greek and Roman history and literature. You see Sulla mentioned there in the beginning of the left-hand column, beginning of the second paragraph of the left-hand column on page 47. You get Sulla, you get mention Caesar, you get his wife Calpurnia. This, by the way, is following Plutarch's Life of Caesar. You get Caesar Augustus and Cicero. You get a more modern writer, Comenius, who is a more recent French writer. So you get all of these classical allusions. They're not overburdened with classical allusions, but they're referred to when Bacon finds it necessary to illustrate the point that he's trying to make. And then finally, I do want to spend a little time talking of the final selection in this work, and that is the essay of Studies published in the first edition of 1597. Once again, one would expect Bacon to be interested in such a thing because he is a person who is much concerned with how one should think, and study is certainly a careful part of that in terms of training the mind and filling the mind with a useful stock of information that one resorts to in thinking about the world around us. It begins with a short sentence divided into three as usual. Studies serve for delight, for ornament, and for ability. When it comes to delight, that's for use in private conversation. For ornament, when you're in sort of public discourse, when you can, if you've studied well, your language will become, the clarity of your language and in fact the ability to fill your sentences with examples from your reading will become important when you're speaking in public. And then finally, for ability, that is when you're conducting business, making sure that you can think well and acutely and that you have similar examples that you can use as a pattern for judgment in the future. Again, the practical man of affairs, Bacon is telling us don't spend too much time in study. That's sloth. To spend too much time in studies is sloth. To use them too much for ornament is affectation, is showing off. And to make your judgment wholly by these abstract principles you gain from your reading is what scholars do, but that's not how you really live your life in the real world. Studies perfect nature, and they are perfected by experience. So studies help improve your mind, but you should also temper what you've learned through studies by practical experience. One of the most famous sentences in all of Bacon, you'll find near the top of the right-hand column on page 50, read not to contradict and confute, nor to believe and take for granted, nor to find talk and discourse, but to weigh and consider. The most important point of reading is to learn how to think to become intelligent. And I may say that when it comes to studies, and what are you doing now but studying at a university, it's perhaps too often emphasized in our culture that one goes to university to get a degree which will help one make more money. No, says Bacon, the point of studying is to learn to think. No doubt that will help you make more money than you otherwise would, but it's to help you think. It's to train the mind so that you can see the world clearly and you can relate to other human beings more clearly. By having a sharply trained mind. But the most famous sentence I was going to mention, or I was on the verge of mentioning, is the following: some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. And then immediately explains what he means by that. That is, some books are to be read, only in parts. You skim through them. Others to be read, but not curiously. You read through them, but not everything in great detail. And then there are some absolute classics in whatever field that you're supposed to read very, very carefully and make part of your mental equipment. And then he goes on and talks about how, by the way, I like that point that some books may be read by deputy, right? You can read, in some cases, you can read abstracts of books. You can rely on what other people have said about books. And then he talks about different genres of reading, right? Histories make men wise. Poets make men witty, mathematics subtle, natural philosophy, that is science, deep, moral works make you grave, logic and rhetoric able to contend, and so on. The very nice use of parallelism there, and notice just how short that sentence is, to the point where he omits, after the very first verb, he omits all the other verbs in those clauses. So it's very nicely done. A fitting end, I think, to our discussion of Bacon's essays, the one of studies. And I do note it, and it's not a coincidence that in your book the selections are bookended with the first essay being the one about truth and the last essay being the one about studies. That Bacon, as I mentioned before, is much concerned with the philosophical understanding of what it is we can know, and even more importantly, what can we do to ensure that we know the world aright. So that's Bacon, one of the outstanding early men of science in English literary history. Standing there at the high water mark of the Renaissance in England and really blazing the trail for those men of science who are going to come after him in the future. After today, we're going to plunge into another poet, perhaps the most unique poet of his age, John Donne. We'll have 2 or 3 discussions of Donne. And because his poetical output really, while not huge, is nevertheless considerably important. And then after that, we will move further along our syllabus.